Hello, everyone. Good evening again. Today's reading is for Tuesday, the third week of Advent. So, if you have your Advent candles, you can light the two purple violet candles and the peace candle, which is pink. We're coming close. The third week, the countdown is on. I'm sure some of you have been counting down to Christmas in various ways, and maybe some of you have even started getting presents, or maybe you've been celebrating some saints' days. Well, today we continue our reading of Tabitha's travels. And in the last chapter, we saw that she was searching for, what were their names? Ishtar and Jotham. And they saw that they'd gone into a cave, and Zechariah and Tabitha were there with Ishtar's caravan, and they're all looking for him now. "We must take our leave now," Zechariah said to Salamar, their host. "We must reach Jerusalem soon, if we are to save Tabitha's father." "And we must remain here until the boys are found," Salamar said. "We each have our destinies, and the stars, or your God, will guide us." "Selah," answered Zechariah in the way of the priests. Salamar ordered that food and water for the trip be brought to the travelers. "Rajan," he called to one of his servants, "take our fastest camel and ride back to Qumran. Tell the monk Nathan that Jotham is once again lost." Turning back to Zechariah, he said, "My friend has a right to know that the ward he entrusted to me is missing." Zechariah nodded, then said to Tabitha, "We must depart now. It is not too far to Jerusalem, but the road is rough." Tabitha looked across the sharp volcanic rocks and added, "Many blessings on you and your son," she said to Salamar. "May you find him and Jotham being well cared for." Salamar seemed surprised that a girl could offer such a blessing. "You remind me of my wife," he said with a smile, and Tabitha took that to be a good thing. With a wave goodbye, Tabitha and Zechariah once again set out toward Jerusalem. "He was right," thought Tabitha of the old priest. "This road is rough." In places it seemed as if the trail were nothing more than piles of sharp stones. "You have fine walking legs," Zechariah said, and Tabitha smiled happily at the compliment. Then he added, "For a girl," and her smile abruptly turned into a glare. She knew better than to speak disrespectfully to an elder, but that didn't keep the harsh words from spinning around inside her head. After a few moments, her guardian turned and looked back at her. "You are quiet. Have you no thanks for a compliment?" Tabitha stewed for a moment, trying not to let anything sarcastic out of her mouth. "I thank you for the compliment," she said finally, "but I would rather be complimented as a person, not just as a girl." "Ah, I see," said the old man, turning back to the trail before him. "So you think it is a disdainful thing to be a girl?" "No," Tabitha almost shouted. "I do not disdain being a girl, but I disdain the way girls are treated." Zechariah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I, too, think it is wrong the way women are treated. That is one reason my wife and I live so far from the city. She is my companion in every way, and my equal in most. But," he continued, "it is not the way of our people. and we must each humble ourselves to the place which God has appointed us. You must humble yourself to your parents and your elders. I must humble myself to the service of my God, my wife, and you." "Me?" Tabitha said, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You are a servant to me?" Zechariah stopped and looked back at her again. "Do I not serve you now?" he asked, "by taking you to find your father? Did I not leave my home and my wife and my work in order to be of service to you?" Tabitha's mouth hung open for a moment. Then she slowly nodded her head in agreement. "Well, then," Zechariah said as he continued walking, "if a priest of God can humble himself to the service of a child, perhaps that child could humble herself to the service of others as well, even if they are boys. I do not think you should be treated as less important because you are a girl, Tabitha. But I do think that you should treat others as more important than yourself, because you are a child of the most holy God." Tabitha had to think on these things for a long while, and by the time her old thoughts had made room for the new ones, she and Zechariah had reached the top of the hill overlooking a magnificent city. "And so we greet Jerusalem," Zechariah announced. Jerusalem! So many buildings, so many people and animals, and so much noise it could be heard even from this hilltop. But what caught Tabitha's eye first was the temple that soared into the air like a mountain of white granite. The city was built on another, lower hilltop and capped it off like a crown of jewels. A green valley cut by a blue stream separated the two travelers from the city, but it would easily be forded. "What do you think?" Zechariah asked at last. "I think it is the most magnificent thing I have ever seen. Can we go there now?" The old priest laughed. "Ha, ha, ha! Yes, O anxious one, you can go there now." And in less time than it takes to pluck a chicken, they had hiked down the hill, crossed the valley and the stream, and entered a gate in the wall of the city. Had she not known differently, Tabitha might have thought this Hebron, so similar were the narrow streets. But it was obviously not En-Gedi, for the people here were much more reserved, and it was not Jericho, because there was none of the vast open spaces of that city. It was crowded and stuffy and smelly, and Tabitha loved it. "Where shall we look first?" Tabitha asked. "At the temple," Zechariah answered. "I must inform my elders of my presence, and I will ask them for any news of your father." Tabitha was thrilled at the thought of entering the temple. They pushed their way through the crowds until they came to a long climb of pure white marble steps. The steps led to a wall where guards stood watch at a gate. The guards eyed Zechariah carefully, then nodded to him, allowing him in. Tabitha followed. Inside the wall was a courtyard full of vendors. They were selling doves and incense and many things Tabitha did not recognize. "Why do these people sell here?" she whispered. "Is this not the house of God?" "Yes, of course," Zechariah answered. "They sell the birds and animals people need to offer sacrifices for their sins." Tabitha nodded understanding and followed Zechariah through a doorway in another wall to another courtyard. Here women sat by themselves praying or stood in small groups talking quietly. "This is a much more pleasant place," Tabitha thought. Zechariah reached a door in yet another wall and stopped. "You may not accompany me any farther," he said. "This door leads to the court of men." Tabitha's face began to warm again in anger. But then she remembered Zechariah's words on the trail and forced the feelings back down to her toes. "Then I shall humble myself to God's service," she said, "and wait for you with the women." Zechariah smiled. "It is difficult, I know," he said, "but it will not always be so." Then he went through the door and was gone. Tabitha wasn't sure if he meant that it would not always be difficult, or that women would not always be treated such, but either way she took comfort in his words and began wandering around the courtyard. Suddenly there was a sharp yank on Tabitha's tunic. "Girl!" she heard from an old squeaky voice. "Girl!" the voice said again, with two more tugs on her tunic. Tabitha looked down to see an ancient woman seated at the base of a column. The woman was dressed in rags, but it was as clean as if she had been just washed up in Noah's flood. "Yes, mother," Tabitha answered in the polite way of her people. "Girl!" the woman said again. "The Messiah is coming!" Tabitha gasped and knelt down. "Yes, this I have heard. Do you know when?" The woman was surprised by Tabitha's reaction, but she looked her in the eyes and whispered, "Within the week this miracle shall happen." Tabitha blinked a few times. "Less than a week?" "Yes, and even sooner." Then she asked, "What are you doing here alone? Where is your mother?" A dove, building a nest atop a nearby column, made 7 complete trips for twigs in the time it took Tabitha to tell the old woman her story. "Jotham of Jericho, you say?" the woman said, filing the name away in her head. "I shall watch for him. And what of your father? How would I know him?" "He is a tall man, a shepherd. He is a Jew, but also a citizen of Rome, though the Romans won't believe him." The old woman looked up in surprise. "I know this man, and I know where they have taken him." Whew. We're getting somewhere. Tabitha's finding it difficult to submit herself to others, isn't she? Especially when she doesn't agree with their viewpoints. I wonder if there's any girls listening to this story. Do they sometimes get mad that they think maybe boys can do some things that they can't do? Or people think that they can't do the same things that boys can do? That's a pretty common thing to get frustrated about. But Zechariah has some wise words. You know, submit is a tough word, and it's one of the toughest words in the New Testament, that second half of the Bible. It's about the toughest thing to do. It means giving up our rights, giving up our will to people with whom we might not exactly agree. That's what we do when we pay our taxes or we drive the speed limit. That's what we do when there's 8 pieces of chicken on the table and there's only 6 people and you want to have all the extra pieces for yourself, but your mom says you have to divide them up. We have to submit to things that we don't want to do. Jesus submitted to the will of his Father in coming to earth. In living a godly life, he submitted. And in dying a sacrificial death at the hands of people who wrongly accused him, he submitted there too. He submitted to earthly authorities, even those authorities he knew to be evil. So is it too much for God to ask that we submit to those in authority over us? God gives us freedom of choice to do as we please. Then he asks us to freely choose to give up that freedom. At first, it doesn't really make sense, but it's really for our own good. There's only room in our lives for one God. We either have to let God be God or take on that job ourselves. Submitting to those in authority over us, humbling ourselves before man and God, is one way we show God that we honor and respect Him as Lord of our lives. 1 Peter chapter 5 says that we are to clothe ourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And we do have a humble King, and we're getting closer and closer to His birth, to celebrating that with our friends, maybe with our family. And it is right to celebrate, and even better to emulate. Good night, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow for the next chapter in the saga of Tabitha's travels.